Good morning. You're watching Senior Notebook on WENY.
Hi, welcome to Senior Notebook. My name is Candy Reed, and my guest today is Michael Joseph. Michael Joseph is a historian, and he's going to share with us information about the Tuskegee Airmen, which was a group of African American military pilots who fought in World War II to serve our country. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Candy.
Yeah, so you're a great historian on the Tuskegee Airmen. Share with us some of the evidence that you know.
Okay, well, as I was just telling you, years ago when I joined the Tuskegee Airmen in 1987, the stories were that the Tuskegee Airmen, Inc. was founded because people did not know or believe that blacks fought during World War II, let alone fought flying sophisticated fighter planes.
Yes.
And the story was that these children of Tuskegee Airmen would go to school, and they would invariably, during show and tell or something similar, they would ask, "What did your dad do during World War II?" And the little black kid would say, "My dad was a fighter pilot," and they would say, "No, it never happened." These are educators that would tell this child, "No, it never happened," because it wasn't in any of the books, and years had passed and people forgot.
Right.
And so invariably the dad or the uncle would come to the school and tell the story about, yes, I was in Italy, I fought during World War II, I flew a P-47 Thunderbolt, I flew a P-51 Mustang or a B-25 medium bomber in the States, and the Tuskegee Airmen, Inc., founded in 1972, now gave an opportunity for all of the Tuskegee Airmen to get together and share a common story. Now we had a narrative that the American public could digest.
Right.
And that's how we know of them today, because of that struggle.
Right. So these were young men that joined the Air Corps to learn how to become a pilot.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
And there were nearly 1,000 pilots were trained.
Okay.
Half of them fought overseas in Europe, and half stayed in the United States.
Right.
So you had the 332nd Fighter Group, comprised of the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. And in the States, you had the 477th.
Right.
So the 477th, if you look at the picture behind me, you'll see a two-engine bomber. They flew that medium bomber called the B-25 Mitchell bomber. And in Europe, they were flying P-51, P-47, P-40 aircraft.
You know, that's interesting because how did these young African American men, very young men, learn about how to sign up before for getting training? Because I would imagine they weren't allowing too many African Americans to get involved in this.
Yeah, initially, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you tried to sign up for that, as many of them did, because flying was very exciting at that time. You had Lindbergh and others that were the great heroes. They were the superstars of that period.
Right.
In the 1930s, you had, there was the so-called golden age of aviation. Howard Hughes, the famous aviator, aircraft designer.
Right.
These were, truly superstars of the day.
Yeah.
And so you had young men growing up in the 1930s wanting to be part of that air service, and blacks were told, no, we're not accepting blacks. And so it wasn't until 1940, FDR, president at that time,
Yeah.
started a program that allowed blacks to sign up and become part of the service.
Yeah, great. Great information. And we're going to take a break right now for commercial, and we'll be right back. There's an interesting story about Corning Glass, how they got involved in that, and we want to, touch base on that as well.
Yeah.
So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Senior Notebook. Our guest today is Michael Joseph, and he's sharing with us the history of the Tuskegee Airmen who fought during World War II. What's interesting to me is why were their tails red, the tail of the plane, as you can see in the photo here?
So that's an interesting story, and I've heard it a few different ways. But one thing that I heard was that, of course, all of the groups that were in fighter command back then had distinguishing tail colors so that you could tell the difference between friend or foe. There were candy stripe red and white, there were blue tails, there were yellow tails, but the red, typically you do not want the enemy to be able to see you from very far off, so you stay away from colors like red.
Yeah.
I have heard that that color was available in large quantities. It was the only color available in large quantities, so they painted their tails red.
I see.
Over time, they began to gain a reputation as an excellent fighting organization, protecting bombers, and I've heard stories that the Germans, in some cases, would see a formation of the red tails and not even engage them because of their reputation. So the aircraft are that they're most associated with is the P-51 Mustang. You see the red tail aircraft behind me, but actually the first red tail was the P-47 Thunderbolt. That's what they flew first, starting in about May 1944. Now, the P-47 Thunderbolt is the largest, heaviest, most powerful fighter plane flown by any side during World War II. Very survivable, very durable aircraft. And that gave them a start in fighter escort.
Wow.
And then they moved to the Mustang.
Right, right. There's an interesting story where Corning Incorporated comes into play with these bombers.
Yes, that's right. Now, Corning had on the order of 100 patents associated with glass and ceramics, spark plug design, that sort of thing during World War II. But something that most people don't realize, and I found out maybe just a few years ago, was that when you have long-range tanks, drop tanks, as you see this aircraft dropping its tanks, in the process of dropping its tanks, after flying a very long range, those tanks were fed by metal tubes. And the metal tubes sometimes did not allow the tanks to disengage. And so the tank would be hooked to the aircraft, and the aircraft would lose control because of the poor aerodynamics associated with having one of those big tanks dangling from the wing, one or two. And so pilots were killed.
Wow.
Corning Incorporated developed a glass that was specially made to survive all the way out to where the target was, and when it came time for the pilot to drop the tanks, those glass tubes would shatter, thus eliminating the problem of tanks hanging up and pilots losing control for that reason.
And losing their lives. Yeah.
That's right.
Yay, Corning.
Yeah, saved many lives.
Tell us a little about this. Is Black History Month, February, and I think it's wonderful that we have this history of the Tuskegee Airmen, but they struggled a lot because Jim Crow laws still existed, and there was discrimination, after they came home.
Oh yeah, the Tuskegee Airmen came about because of segregation.
Right.
You had to have not just if you wanted to have black pilots, you could not have white nurses and white enlisted people and others serving under black officers. Typically, your pilots were officers. Wow. And so the whole complex were blacks at Tuskegee and other bases. They had white instructors, but for every pilot, and there were about 1,000 pilots, you needed about 14 support personnel.
Right.
You needed the nurses, the engineers, and the
Right.
technicians, and meteorologists and others to do that work. And so during the segregated days, it was very difficult for blacks to be regarded as equal partners
Right.
in this endeavor. And it was a great battle waged to actually get in the war. They wouldn't even let them in the war in the beginning
Yeah.
because they felt white commanders would never accept them
Never
in the
accept them.
battlefield,
Right.
and it would be a detriment to morale. And over time, and blacks were believed to not have the intelligence to fight and fly and work on sophisticated aircraft. This was state of the art. P-47s and P-51s were the most advanced aircraft the Allies had. And so, although blacks were really adept at flying and had been
Right.
flying for quite some time,
Right.
you know, Bessie Coleman in 1922 got her license in France. She couldn't
True.
get it here.
Couldn't get it here.
Eugene Jacques Bullard, the Black Swallow of Death, was
Right.
flying in World War I in 1917. Couldn't fly here.
Couldn't fly here, but he had a wonderful pilot's license.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and a record. Had a wonderful
Well,
record.
Well, our history has come a long way, and things have changed and developed. And we are so thankful for you, Michael, to really get into the history of the Tuskegee. You know
Yeah.
so much about aircraft, which is really a great part of the Red-tailed Hawks. And
Yeah, well, when I joined Tuskegee Airmen, I was sworn in 1987 by Judge George Fleary, who was my cousin. People were saying that it never happened, that blacks never flew in World War II aircraft.
right, but we
Okay.
did.
Yeah, we did, and it's just history
Yeah.
that had to be brought back.
Yeah, and I'm glad we have that history. And we're going to post on our screen, you can see the website there where you can go to get more information about the Tuskegee Airmen. And once again, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today and
Thank
sharing
you.
this history of African American pilots.
Thank you. It's so good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Senior Notebook will return in a moment.